Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for the Ann Arbor District Library, which is the best library? Am I on now? I think I'm on. I think I wasn't on before. I'm Amanda Uhle. I'm an author of Destroy This House and a book publisher at McSweeney's, and I live here in Ann Arbor. I'm so happy to have Jess Walter joining us here. May I read your introduction, your bio?
It'll look bad
Would
if I
that be
do, so
okay?
you
Yeah.
probably should.
I
Yeah.
think I will do that. With glasses is a much better way to do it. Jess Walter is the author of 7 previous novels, including the bestsellers The Cold Millions and Beautiful Ruins, the National Book Award finalist The Zero, and Citizen Vince, winner of the Edgar Award for Best Novel. His short fiction, collected in The Angel of Rome and We Live in Water, has won the O. Henry Prize, the Pushcart Prize, and appeared 3 times in Best American Short Stories. He lives in his hometown of Spokane, Washington. Thanks for coming to the Midwest.
Yeah, thank you. And also in the Best of McSweeney's, too. So,
excuse me. I left out the Best of McSweeney's.
Which should be in there. Yeah.
Jess, what have you written for McSweeney's? Now I'm curious and embarrassed.
I think I've been in
look
McSweeney's
it up.
5 times. Yeah.
On our humor website?
No,
fiction?
short stories
Short
in the magazine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in the magazine.
I don't do humor. So
Okay.
no, I'm kidding.
Yeah. That's actually not true at all. I'm going to just say, So Far Gone is your new novel. I'm just going to lift it up here so we can all see it. This novel is so funny.
Thanks.
And people just love this book. I know it's getting lots of accolades and lots of attention right now. As I was telling you earlier, so I read this book when it came out, which was last summer, I think, in hardcover.
A year ago tomorrow, I think.
Okay, last June. And then I agreed to do this conversation with you, I don't know, a month or 2 ago. And the book had been in the rearview mirror a little bit. And so I was trying to remember it. And I had one really strong memory, which is this book is so fun. It's so fun to read. And what's interesting about that for me as a reader is that I think that the stories that you're telling, and to me this is 2 stories that are really very serious. One is about this family, and one is about the United States and what we're facing right now. And those are both very serious stories, and yet I laughed. I couldn't wait to read the next section, and you made it such a joy. How did you do that?
Yeah, I think it's funny when you, as a writer, you write a certain way and you don't stop to diagnose why you do it that way. But I've had to answer this so many times that I've started to question myself why it is that everything that I write I want to lace with humor, not just to entertain, but maybe to invite in. And maybe it goes to the first writers that we loved. And the first writer I really fell in love with was Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And I felt like the humor invited you in, and then the humanism made you think about what the book did. I have a very good friend and novelist named Jim Lynch who said, when you're going well, you write stand-up tragedy. And I've always thought that was just the very best description of what it is I'm attempting to do.
Yeah, really such a fun and beautiful read. I was going to read some of what what the press has said about this. It's a witty caper, which I was wondering how you sort of connect that wit and that humor that we were talking about with the idea of a mystery. I mean, you've written mystery novels before.
I guess, kind of. I'm always surprised.
Kind of?
Well,
Yeah.
I guess I'm genre blind.
Uh-huh.
I don't ever sit down and think I'm writing this genre, I'm writing that genre. I start writing a story and it kind of tells me what it wants to be. And I've never written like a character who goes around solving crimes. In that way, no. But my early training was as a police reporter at a newspaper. And I'm one of those people who believes that things happen. I don't sit down and write fiction and relive, the most tortured part of my teenage years, only because it was all torture.
Yeah.
I find myself thinking about things that happen and what causes the next thing to happen. And so with this novel, it's the story of a journalist like I was, named Reese Kinnick, who is an environmental journalist who's been flushed out of his job, out of his identity, and on Thanksgiving in 2016, gets in an argument with his Christian nationalist son-in-law, who is trying to convince him that the NFL is part of a grand global conspiracy. And losing his temper, he punches his son-in-law. And driving away, he throws his cell phone out a car window and decides to live off the grid. 7 years later, there's a knock at his door in this cabin in the woods, and he looks out and sees two children and asks them, are they selling chocolate bars or magazines for their school? And they say, we're your grandchildren. And his daughter, who he's estranged from, has gone missing. And when you have a setup like that, when the story came to me that way, it's a sort of gift. You say, he's got to find his daughter. And later, when the Christian nationalists come and swoop his grandchildren up, now he's got to find his grandchildren. But the beautiful part of that is I started thinking, it is a sort of a mystery novel, but imagine you've been living off the grid with no cell phone, no computer, and you come out now to have to find someone. Even as an investigative reporter, you were lacking the tool that anyone else could use. I started thinking about Sherlock Holmes. If he came around now and he was smelling like, I smell gunpowder, and I think he was wearing Aquavelva, and any 9-year-old would hold up their phone and say, I've got his Instagram page right here, and he's posed with the victim, you know. He's at such a disadvantage, and that struck me as both charming and funny and a great place to put a character, trying not just to find these people, but to put his family back together after reacting to the world the way that I sometimes want to.
One of the things I love about this character is that he has this wish that I think many of us maybe in this room share, this wish to just opt out. And I don't know if you all remember 2016, 2017, which is when this argument happens with the family. Reese, your character, just decides to go away. Yeah. And I think, I'm attributing this to him, and maybe you can disagree or agree, but I think that he thought he could chill out for a little bit, and maybe if he emerged again, the world would have righted itself. And then here he comes, and it's the mid-2020s, and here we are. It has not righted itself.
Yeah, the novel really, I was working on a different novel, and I tend to work in sort of two registers. Beautiful Ruins, my most, I guess, well-known novel, took me 15 years to write. I would pick it up, set it down, I'd work on other things. I would jettison some, I would come back to it, and then every once in a while I get an idea that is just like a fever dream that I write all the way through. So in 2023, I kept waking up in the middle of the night thinking, we're going to elect this guy again. It's going to happen again. And I was filled with such kind of anxiety and dread. And my phone buzzed at me one Saturday and told me I had been spending an average of 6.5 hours a day on it.
Uh-oh.
I know, and I don't write on my phone. I don't get any texts. That was me doom scrolling, and then I made the mistake. A candidate for office somewhere sent me a note saying they could save democracy for $7, and so I donated. And pretty soon I was hearing from every city council candidate in every city and state, and I was giving them all $7. And I was so taken with the anxiety and dread, which the tech companies have intentionally fed us in this loop, this algorithmic loop, that I had that urge to throw my cell phone out the window. And so taking that and just, sort of running with that idea led to that, to the question, what would happen? Could you turn your back on everything? And initially I thought it would be a sort of Rip Van Winkle story. Like you said, he would run away in 2016 and he'd reemerge in 2020 and say, or 2024 and say, well, at least that's all over, But
that
of course,
was the feeling that you tapped into, yes.
But of course, it wasn't over. And I finished the book about a week before the election and sent it to my agent and said, I sure hope when this comes out, it reads like historical fiction. Mm-hmm. And of course, it didn't. We're right back in that sort of sickening place we felt in 2016. Only worse. Yeah. And again, then the question for me is how to make that lively and to not make fun of the situation we're in, but to put it in its perspective, which is what humor does.
I want to revisit one of the moments that you just mentioned, which I think is the moment I can say, you just had me. You had me in your grip as a novelist. It's when he tosses his smartphone out the window. He hurls it. The car is moving. And I think there's, for a modern person, for modern people like us, there's a moment where you go, oh no, there's like it's almost like a little fear. What's he going to do?
Yeah.
And then the freedom sets in, right? It's intoxicating.
Yeah, it was I'd like a moment of wish fulfillment in every book, and
Yeah.
that I really did imagine it bouncing once on the highway and then going into the median. But as anyone knows, when your phone is out, just how crushing and heartbreaking it is. I have worked really hard since that 6-hour notification to get mine back under 2 hours. But I just spent a month in Europe, and I couldn't have gone anywhere without GPS. I mean, it's amazing what we rely on it for now. It's I'm standing in front of something in Bruges, and I immediately pull it out and look up, what is this castle I'm standing in front of, and that the incredible utility of this thing, disconnected from what I think is some really cynical corporate maneuvering. One of the details that I love and hate about early Facebook is one of the engineers came to the executives at Facebook and said, look, these people are all connected with their friends. We can tell them your friend is in this restaurant next door. It's the same thing that runs Tinder or any of the dating apps. And the Facebook people said, oh no, we don't want them seeing their friends in real life. We want their friends to exist only here. And that sort of cynical thing, when they originally thought we would only want what we would only seek what we love on these things. We would want our friends and family and cute pictures of cats. But they realized we like that, but what really keeps us flipping is what we're terrified of. And so while I'm getting texts and emails all day about the encroaching fascism, someone on the right is getting emails all day and texts saying that they want to change the gender of your children in school. We are being fed this thing that divides us in such a profound way. And as someone who comes from a journalism background, and that was the media, and still when people talk about the media, they talk about CNN or 60 Minutes or Fox News. More than half of Americans say all their news now comes from their phone.
Yeah, social media.
Yeah, from social media. And they're getting a reflection. They're getting a platonic cave in which the only image that's against the wall is that dread and anxiety and a few kittens doing adorable things.
And I think it feels so good to the reader at that moment when you're like, Reese, he's going to get rid of the phone. He's going to the woods. And it feels like he's chosen a self-exile. And I think the reader feels like he won't come out of it. He's there. But then can you talk about what draws him out? Because those feelings about, making that choice and then reversing it to go back into the world.
I mean, I think the first thing that draws him out are two really adorable grandchildren. And he and his daughter, you can't write a novel that is a political speech. It can't be didactic. You have to embody the characters at some level. And having been a parent for 40 of my 60 years, I consider myself a pretty good writer, but a great parent, honestly. And the hardest thing about writing Reese was someone who could not see his daughter for 7 years. I can't go a day without calling my kids in. They're like, you don't have to tell us you love us after every conversation, Dad. But imagining that Reese's granddaughter comes to the door at the same age that the fissure between he and his daughter first opened. Because I wanted, the book starts with those grandchildren on the porch. You find out later about why he's there. And I really wanted that moment to shock him out of this stupor that he had gotten into, because that's what I finally decided. That urge for me to run away and hide, no matter how terrifying and irritating this phone is in my pocket, I can't. I have to stay engaged in the world. And so I needed to bring Reese back into the world. So it was bringing this vision of his granddaughter who reminds him in that very moment, of his daughter when they were the closest, right before they started drifting apart, the way a lot of parents, the way a lot of dads and daughters do at 13, 14, and then hopefully they circle back at some point. But for Reese and his daughter, he blamed her for all the decisions that she made. And when I'm writing, there's always a moment of kind of character connection that I have when I didn't know something about a character and I write it and maybe it happens in dialogue and I think, oh my God, that's been the key to the whole story. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's a moment late in the book when Reese is with his daughter and she says, she's on the phone with her husband, this Christian nationalist, and they're arguing, and he says that Reese, trying to be a good dad, finally says, that must be so hard, dealing with him. And he says, and she looks up and says, what's been hard? Dealing with your disappointment all these years. And the fact that he's held her responsible for her husband's views, to me, I realized was really the kind of emotional underpinning of the whole book. And so that was what draws him out, reconciling with this girl that he lost not 7 years ago, but really 15, 18.
Longer ago. I heard the room groan a little bit with that line about disappointment. This is the thing about this book. There's so much plot. There's so much excitement. And then when those emotional truths come up, they just get you. So thank you for writing that kind of book.
Oh, thank you.
I was going to read, I didn't ask you about reading, I was going to read 2 lines that I loved in the Rip Van Winkle department.
Yeah.
So he's on this adventure to rescue his children at one point, and he connects back up with really a whole cast of characters. We could go through each of them, but I'd love to talk about his a slightly acerbic former girlfriend, Lucy, who, excuse me, we will meet right here. Lucy Park burst into laughter when Kinnick asked her, "Who covers the radical right these days?" She says, "The government reporter." It took a moment for him to understand what she was saying, that no longer was the fringe on the fringe. She explained to him that state legislators, sheriffs, county commissioners, even members of Congress openly expressed beliefs that would have gotten them labeled as members of a hate group a few years earlier, or at least as extremists or unelectable loons. So can you talk about
Yeah, so my very first book as a reporter, as a 27-year-old reporter, I got called out to a case that was happening in the woods of North Idaho called Ruby Ridge. And I was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, myself and a team of reporters, for our coverage of that case, which was honestly a civil rights case. It was a right-wing white separatist family that moved up to the Idaho woods just to basically be alone because they thought the world was about to end. The government at that time was investigating the Aryan nations and other groups, the order, that were committing all sorts of crimes, and so they infiltrated this area. They convinced this man, Randy Weaver, to saw the barrels off some shotguns. Now he's committed a felony. They wanted him to be an informant that would spy on other groups, but he and his family were so incredibly paranoid that when they approached him, he armed his kids and said, "You will not take us alive." This set off a standoff. The Marshal Service surrounded the cabin, tried to figure out how to get him out. While they were surveilling the cabin, a gunfight broke out. A U.S. Marshal was killed, and Randy Weaver's 14-year-old son was shot in the back as he ran away. The next day, the FBI surrounded the cabin without calling out a surrender warning, opened fire, wounding Randy Weaver and his friend, and killing Randy's wife, Vicky, shooting her in the face while she held a baby. So the first part of the story I covered was how the government could mess this case up so badly, could treat a family like a gang of criminals. And then the second part of the story that was equally as fascinating to me were these incredibly strange fringe beliefs, how a Vietnam veteran and his all-American wife could end up living on a mountaintop, afraid that the UN was going to invade any day, that their kids were going to be given shots at a public school that would give them AIDS. Where do these weird beliefs come from? So 1992, 34 years ago, I'm on a mountaintop in Idaho, and there are hundreds of protesters with these signs, and they were the strangest collection of conspiracy theories. And so for me, the last 34 years, to watch those conspiracy theories slowly make their way into the mainstream, some dog whistled, some almost verbatim, some cleaned up and tidied up as if that sort of jingoistic, xenophobic rhetoric is nothing but a different political view. To watch it, the way in which the creep of those things, and as a journalist, I especially that hurts me especially, because having covered those groups and seen the inroads that they made, for someone who disappeared the way Reese does, to realize that this thing that you covered as one thing is now the government, is now policy. Now, was there a way to talk about some right-wing political beliefs that, were they sometimes branded things that they weren't? Yeah, I think sometimes they were. But I think for Reese, the shock is really in the other direction. And for me, frankly, that's what it's been the last 30 years watching. And conspiracy theories are not only on the right. The number of Americans who believe Donald Trump faked his own assassination attempt. I'm not saying he didn't, but we want to believe the conspiracies that make sense to us, that make sense of the world to us. And so it isn't hard to imagine how many people still think that the Kennedy assassination was fake, that the moon landing was faked. One of the things that got me going on this novel was realizing that I couldn't really ignore the fact that families and friendships have been cleaved by this political division. We don't just vote for different candidates. We have entirely different sets of reality. I have a good friend from elementary school who we were in space nerds together. He was a computer scientist. He now believes the Earth is flat. And I've lost the ability to communicate with him, because if we can't start from a round Earth, then I don't know I don't know where to go. And I bemoaned that in a way. Writing the novel was almost trying to find a way back to that friendship, to the nephew that who doesn't talk to us anymore, and that's been one of the, as I've gone around and talked to this book, the number of people who've told me that they've lost friendships, that they have relatives. I mean, how many, did your parents even know the politics of their neighbors? I don't think mine did. And if they did,
that was one of the things you didn't talk about
right,
when I was growing up.
And if they did, they certainly didn't, alienate neighbors because of that. I think this division has grown to a place where, as a novelist, I didn't feel like I could ignore it.
Well, I think one of the things that I really noticed is that the characters who are right-leaning, even the conspiracy theorists, I think you handle them with a lot of tenderness and kind of openness and understanding. That's almost surprising. Have you, did you set out to do that? I mean, they're still villainous in their way, but did you set out to paint them with that lens? And
yeah, one of them certainly is villainous. There's a character who is based on a real character that in the Northwest who poaches eagles. He goes on Indian reservations and leaves carcasses, and when the eagles come, he kills them so he can part out the feathers and make money. And this actual person who did this, in court, his defense was dominion over animals, which thankfully the judge rejected. But that I didn't treat that character with too much understanding.
Tenderness, yeah.
But Shane, Reese's son-in-law, I wanted to really look at how the information that's coming in, we are getting entirely different sets of information. Just watch Fox News and Newsmax someday and look at right-wing media, especially on your phone, and you'll see the drip dread that they're getting, and the reason in which they're they're forming an entirely different world. So yeah, I definitely wanted to make sure that I found my way into Shane so that he felt to me like a real human being, and also one that Bethany, a character that I ended up liking, would have fallen for in some way. And there's also a moment where, you know, Bethany is angry that her father is upset by her choice in men, and she says, she thinks, did he think that every man lined up and I just got to pick the, you know, you move along, Brad Pitt, you seem a little narcissistic, you know. And so I loved that, that when I got to Shane, because the book sort of opens up each of these characters that climbs on the bus, I try to open up, you know, their version of things. And I knew I would be writing towards Shane, and it was going to be the biggest challenge. But by the time I got there, I had a real soft spot for him as well.
Yeah, that shows. I'm curious now whether you've had reactions from people who lean further right than you do, for instance. Has the book sort of gotten out there, and have you heard from people?
I actually really looked forward to that.
Yeah.
You know, because as I said, this was my envisioning how this period will pass. I just was in Europe, and I did all these interviews, and the book came out in the Netherlands and Belgium, where it's I had to go to so many different events and explain America to the confused Dutch and Belgians, and it was funny. My publicist from the Netherlands sent me this Belgian newspaper where there's a huge picture of me, and it says, like, I don't speak Dutch, so I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like, Ik ben een toxisch optimist, because I did say I'm a toxic optimist. So it just said, I am a toxic optimist in the Belgian press.
Fantastic way to be remembered.
It is, yeah. My son actually coined that. But I do think that, I don't think this period outlives Trump. I think he is a singular, strange combination of fame and animating the desire for your anger and hatred to have voice. And so I don't think he doesn't have policies that anyone else can pick up. It isn't like the day his presidency ends, we all have a big square dance. But I do think things start to get better. And so, but as I was working on this, I really wanted to engage with people. And it's been interesting. The reviews have been great. And I don't really read Goodread or Amazon reviews, but sometimes people send them to me. And there's a section of the book. Actually, I'll read it real quickly, because some people will just send me emails that say only page 32, and I know exactly what they're talking about. This is Reese Kinnick. How to explain self-exile. Part of it had been the fight with Shane and Bethany's reaction. It symbolized the dark, sour turn the whole country had taken. As a journalist, as an American, as a rationalist, Kinnick had come to terms with the fact that 20% of his countrymen were greedy assholes. But then, in 2016, the greedy assholes joined with the idiot assholes and the paranoid assholes in what turned out to be an unbeatable constituency. Kinnick realizing that the asshole ceiling was much higher than he'd thought, perhaps half the country. So when the book went on sale, every once in a while, Amazon will do like one of those $1.99 sales. And when that happened, all of a sudden there were a whole bunch of one-star reviews. And then one guy sent me his one-star review from Goodreads. He emailed it to me.
Helpful.
And he said, I used to like your books, but I don't anymore. And he wrote in his review, if you didn't vote the way he did, Jess Walter thinks you're an asshole. And I wrote him back and I said, I don't think that. And I showed him that part and I said, Kinnick had come to terms with that. I said, I've crunched the numbers and I know I've done all the research. 12% of Americans are assholes. And they're on both sides, actually. I said, I do happen to think there are more on your side. I'm sorry. And some of them, I think, have risen to the top of the Republican Party. But there's no way. My neighbor voted the opposite way I do, and he's my favorite person on the planet. If I had a flat tire, he's exactly who I would go to. And I said, and look at Kinnick. What's he do? He punches someone and moves to the woods. That's a real right-wing thing. He's become the thing that he hates. He's a terrible father. Like, this is not I don't stand behind what Kinnick did. And we had this back and forth, and I said, I think you ought to be able to read what this guy thinks, and I ought to be able to hear why you voted for Trump. And we go back and forth, and finally he said, without irony, I'm sorry, I've been kind of an asshole. And then he changed his review from 1 star to 3.
Oh,
And
good.
I felt like, I think I've just cured America. Like,
Maybe you did.
2 stars at a time. But that exchange was actually kind of meaningful for me because it is the conversation I want to have. And I want to ask that guy, did your parents hate their neighbors because of their views? I doubt it. Like, I think what I wrote toward in the end was the fact that Reese and Shane care about the same thing, which is their family. And whatever that is that brings us back together is the part that the toxic optimist is starting to dream about.
And Reese is facing so much, all these issues that we just talked about, and also he's at the end of his career as a journalist. So I think, one of the things that was really meaningful to me is just watching him grapple with, who am I? His family's, he's sort of in exile from his family. The country's a mess to his mind, and his career, I don't know whether his job ended as a journalist or whether he retired. I can't remember that part of it.
No, he gets laid off in a big
journalism is
journalism is an almost impossible place, and I do take that incredibly personally. That was my training, and the cynicism with which people talk about the media, and most of the media was a newspaper that landed on your porch that told you what the cross-country team did at state and why the sidewalk was torn up in front of your house. And we've thrown that entire system of checks and balances out the window, and people's distrust of reporters. I have to tell you, we were not paid very much. The most I ever made as a newspaper reporter was $30,000, and I was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. It was the 90s, but still, no one is doing it to pass along their view of how the world should be. It's a group of the most slackery idealists you've ever seen. I always say a newsroom is the greatest collection of B students you'll ever come across. And all of them striving in their tiny way to make sure the city council does what they're supposed to do, or that the school board takes care of even the kids in the poorest neighborhood. I mean, and the fact that somehow they were demonized so successfully over however many years, and that job doesn't even really exist anymore. My brother is the sports editor of our hometown newspaper, and almost all of his reporters I will see in restaurants on the weekends working to make a little extra money. Yeah,
and teachers too,
right? Yeah, and the fact that, so I do take that very personally, and I think part of the book became about that feeling that I think a lot of people get in their 50s and 60s of impending extinction. And when Reese ends up working with a retired police officer named Chuck, who also feels as if he's been put out to pasture in this way. And for both of them, I think it's a way to try to feel vital and needed again, this small little adventure that they go on.
So I have another couple of questions about your characters, but I want to make sure people know that we will take audience questions in a few minutes, so prepare them in your mind now. Speaking of, so we were talking about Chuck and about Reese sort of asserting themselves and defining who they are. I feel like there were a number of other instances with your characters in this wonderful book where there's sort of misunderstandings, between Bethany, his daughter, and Reese, and misunderstandings that really colored how they saw one another for years. Certainly how she saw her father. There's also teenage Leah's romance, and there's a misunderstanding there. And all of that, I feel like your characters do this beautiful thing where they're sort of defining themselves, and they're saying, no, I'm not what you think. And I love that about you. I feel like almost all of your characters do that somewhere. Can you talk about that aspect of things a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that kind of just life, though? Yeah. I mean, we work so hard to exude some version of ourselves, and yet it's never quite right. And I think I saw that in my children at various points where my daughter one time, her therapist urged her to write a letter. My daughter she never complained about anything. She was so sweet all the time, and she was seeing a therapist, and the therapist said, "I think you should write your dad a letter." And it was as if had stood in front of an X-ray machine. She just saw all my insecurities, and I marveled first. I kept the letter because it was so beautifully written, and but every sentence was like, "Wow, she sees right through me," and that realization that the whole time I was parenting, there was a reflection that was coming back on her. She was seeing this other version of what I was saying and what I was doing. And she and my other daughter do a version of my scoff, which is when your daughter shows you the logo she's drawn for her new club, and you point out that it looks suspiciously like a pot leaf, and she goes, "Ah," and then I go, though that there's something in the act of parenting that makes you so exposed and naked, and then something in the act of being a child that does the same. And so you know this person so incredibly well, and yet the thing you know about them is only one part of them. And so for Bethany to come back later in the book and assert who she is, for Leah to be at an age where she's deciding she maybe doesn't want this religion that's been forced upon her, that's the part of fiction writing that I love. And I think because I was a parent so young, I was a dad when I was 19, I feel like that's when I became a fiction writer in a way, because you suddenly care about someone more innately and intuitively than you ever could have before. It's not that they're attractive or that they provide you food. You just all of a sudden care about someone more than yourself. And that, I think, creates that sort of ability to empathize and to, that I think is what we manifest when we write fiction.
And you really see it. These characters spend this time apart when Reese is in exile, and then they come back together, and it's all there. It's like no time change. Those vulnerabilities and that openness is still there. It's really
It's
beautiful.
funny. One of the I had a good friend who gave a great edit of the book, and I wanted Reese's daughter to forgive him right away, and she said, "I'm not sure that's believable." And there's always like a few blind spots, where I so wanted these characters to get back together, and there was a lot of mileage there that had to be accounted for, and
years and years.
Yeah, that was one of those rewriting things you have to do.
Well, I wonder if anyone in the audience has a question for Jess. Oh.
How long did it take to write this book? I love speaking to classrooms because that's the question they always ask. How long does it take to write a novel? And I now have the answer. It takes between 1 and 15 years. Beautiful Ruins took 15 years. This took 1. I started in late 2023, and I really did, because I had this image and I knew it was going to be this sort of very small odyssey, that it would cross a couple of borders, that it would essentially take place over a few days. It felt like it was going to come in this sort of fast way. I was also going through some health issues, and when anything chains me to my desk, then I deal with it by writing, and so I just tried to write all the way through. So yeah, it took about a year from conception to writing. What always happens with a novel is the first 10 pages take months sometimes, and then you start kind of getting into the characters, and there's a moment when it starts speeding downhill, and for me, when those characters felt alive enough that when I left them, I felt like I left them kind of leaning toward their next move. Then going back to the desk the next day was kind of a treat. Yeah. Yeah, how do you develop the characters and how do you come to know them in that way? You know, it's never quite the same, but, and I don't always know them right away. There's an old acting saying that actors will say, I start with a hat, they start with a piece of wardrobe. And sometimes a character will be that way for me. They'll see one thing about them, and then I'll sort of start building that way. But what happens is there's usually a moment that, you've probably heard authors talk about fictional characters in that way that sounds sort of magical, you know. The characters got up and acted on their own. And I used to just think that was the stupidest thing, and that authors said that to try to convince us mortals not to try it, you know. Because when I did that, when I just let characters act on their own, they just sat around and drank beer like my brother and me. And so, but then there is a moment when you're writing so deeply, and it's really sentences you're writing. It's really an act of music. So you're thinking, so you're writing a melody, you're writing this melody, and anyone who knows when music surprises you is when it starts to become interesting, when the melody changes in a way, key change you don't expect or something. And it's sort of that same thing with characters. There's a moment when you imagine them doing something and you think, oh my God, of course they would do this way. One thing that I try to do, because I like to write characters, these characters are closer to me. I'm a father, even though my daughters and I haven't had this rift, I can imagine one, but I write outside my experience quite a bit. And in that case, I like to give the characters some emotional connection that I've had. So in Beautiful Ruins, Pasquale Tursi is an innkeeper who has lived in his small town his whole life and dreamed of going elsewhere and doing something else, but family obligations have kept him in this small village. I have lived in Spokane, Washington my whole life, and family obligations have kept me there. And so if I can connect on that emotional level, I can research what it would be like to be an innkeeper. And it doesn't always have to be something as big and profound as that. Sometimes it's something, you know, really small. But if I can find some emotional connection to a character, for me, that's the way to start getting inside their head. And when you start having a character act in some way that you wouldn't, that's when it really starts to feel freeing. It is a little hypnotic, I guess. I feel like that, you know, when I used to make fun of people who said the characters got up and acted on their own, there was a point in Beautiful Ruins in about the 12th year when all of a sudden the characters actually did start acting on their own, and I felt so foolish for claiming that they couldn't do that, because I had gotten to know them so well, I'd lived with them so long, that when I sat down to write them, it did feel more like you were conducting electricity than you know, trying to invent what they did. The worst thing that can happen as a fiction writer is when action feels like a toggle switch. Does he go in or does he not go in? Does he ask her to marry him or does he not ask her to marry him? When you can't, when you're just trying to figure out what they should do, and then so when the moment comes when you know what they would do, and especially when it's what you wouldn't do, that's when it's kind of thrilling.
When you wrote about Reese going to live in the woods, how much of it all was Thoreau on your mind?
How much of Reese's motivation was Thoreau? Quite a little bit. I love Thoreau's philosophy. I love the philosophy of Walden. The story of Walden is a little bit of a myth. His mom did his laundry. He had friends bring him food all the time. He was not that far out in the wilderness. But all the ideas that he encompassed there, the ideas of self-reliance, the ideas of looking inward, the idea of separating yourself from the maddening crowd, all of that is so incredibly right and real. And yet there's something in American mythology that constantly leads us in directions that I think are not helpful. And so how many people move to Montana and then want to slam the door behind them? No one else can come in these woods. I'm protecting them from all the people who come in the woods. The place that I sent Reese is actually family land that we own. And It's such beautiful land, and I feel like the very best thing I can do for that land is to stay away from it most of the time. Partly because there's no good sushi up there, but also because my being there is the first part of the problem. And so I definitely had Thoreau in mind as a sort of philosophical inspiration for Rees. But Rees is not very good himself at his Walden experiment. He goes into town to the bar all the time, meets a couple of friends, and causes some more emotional problems. So I wanted to deal with the myth of Thoreau, as well as what I think is some beautiful philosophy that came out of that experiment. Yeah.
Let's delve into your toxic optimism.
Sure.
Couple of things. Thank you for so succinctly putting to right what journalism is supposed to be.
Oh, thank you.
I so miss it. Newspapers since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
So, are newspapers going to rise from the ashes?
Our newspaper is going to rise from the ashes like a phoenix. How many of you had a paper route? Did any of you have a paper route? All right, think about what an insane business this was. Let's cut some trees down, put the news on it, and let's have 12-year-olds on bicycles not only deliver our product, but collect the money afterward. The whole thing made no sense. And my kids don't have, a newspaper still lands on my porch. I take so many magazines. I feel like I'm in newspapers. I feel like I'm single-handedly trying to keep journalists in business. And so, no, I think the delivery system is probably done for. But journalism will not go away, and it will find its way back. And I would urge you to support places like ProPublica and regional groups that do investigative journalism, helping your local newspaper find a way to exist online. In many ways, it's a far more reasonable way to deliver news. The problem is that the companies that are now running the media, Meta, X, they have no public interest. The public interest that newspapers had was not something commercial. It really was a public interest. We have to demand that if they are going to be the main purveyors of media and news, that they also have to have a public interest. And how we do that, that's like problem number 614 that we've got in front of us. But when I meet young people who want to be journalists, I tell them, don't worry about the delivery system. All you need is a great sense of curiosity and the desire to transmit that to people, whether that's on a podcast or on TikTok or on Substack or in a blog. The medium is going to change, but the profession will always be there. And I hope it'll continue on in ways that we haven't even imagined. And I hope that there's a kind of rise of community-minded journalism again. That would be, but I don't know if I'm that toxic an optimist. I'd love to be. Part B. Yes. Our data center is going to be the great connector. Are we going to rise up together and stop data centers? It's pretty great to see it happening in communities everywhere. Right. They really are. We'll see. I mean, the mad rush to make as much money off AI as we can right now before the inevitable stock market crash happens. I had a good friend who started a chemistry textbook called like chemistry.com or something back in the first .com boom. And they offered him like $8 million for this company. And he's like, oh my God, I'm going to make $8 million. And the fine print was you have to work for us for this many years. And we're going to pay for half of it in stock in our company, which was called business.com. Back then, you just put .com at the end of anything and you were worth however many $1 million. And when that all evaporated, it was so comical in a way and so obvious, and yet what rose out of that was something else. And so I think this mad dash right now to build these data centers and to have AI fuel everything is a kind of fever, because they realize there's no regulation right now. And I think you're right. I think the backlash, I hope the backlash fuels that kind of populism. Rebecca Solnit has this great theory, which I love. She said, people on the left keep waiting for the great man theory, for one person to rise up. They rose up. It was Minneapolis. And I think to watch these communities rise up is sort of my hope.
Maybe one last question, if there was one. There was not. There is. Final question.
Did I have the whole plot in my head, and did I know what the ending was going to be? No, not really. When I write, I sort of imagine the journey that I'm going to take. And so I knew I was sending this grandfather out to try to find his grandchildren. I knew that he would cross two borders, one into Idaho, one into Canada. That seemed like a smart thing. I knew it would take place over a couple of days. That most of the action would. I did not, and I kept thinking about the idea of violence and thinking back again to Ruby Ridge and to the way in which when the violence happens, it's real. And so one of the questions I kept asking myself is, I've got these violent militiamen, and they are violent, and yet they're ridiculous too. And they're called the Army of the Lord, and they had their bumper stickers made up, AOL, before they realized that everyone would think it above their first email address. And yet we live in a world right now that is a little bit ludicrous and dangerous. And so goes almost back to your very first question, the stand-up tragedy, the tragedy part has to be real. And so that was the big question I asked myself, and I won't give away the ending, but how does the violence, the very real threat of violence, factor into the end of this? And that almost kept me going. I feel like if I don't know what's going to happen, the reader probably won't be able to guess either. I did know that the question hanging over the novel for me was, can Reese find his way back to his family? And that's the thing that keeps me writing, posing that question, to which the answer is the thing that I hope will animate the reader as they follow through too.
So full of love and humor and plot twists. So Far Gone. Now in paperback this week.
Yeah, now in
So,
paperback. Yeah, maybe on Netflix soon if everything goes well. Yeah.
Fantastic! I did not know that. Thank you for being here, Jess
Yeah,
Walter.
thank you,
So
Amanda.
nice to have you.
Thank you all. Oh, and I guess I'll sign books if anyone,
Book
or
signing
answer other questions
out
out
in
there.
the lobby.